Hi, this week I'd like to explore custom renderers. There's a couple ways we can use custom renderers. One way is using like a dependency injection, like basically sending a message down to the native platform saying, hey, go do something. Have the native platform do something, either persist something to a database or, get the location or grab a photo from the camera. The other way we can do it is by modifying a control and making a control work differently. So there is an example that I'll post with the video using a custom render with an entity. And this is actually a really good example. Basically, an entity is something that we're using in Xamarin Forms. That's basically one of the XAML controls that we're using, which is really an input box. That's all it is a text box. We call it entity in Xamarin Forms. So it's an abstraction. So that way when we put in that XAML, calling it an entity, when this control renders on an iPhone, it actually renders out as a UI text field. And that's what like native iOS developers, so iPhone developers would be using controls that are all like UI text field, UI label, UI image. So they have all of their native controls. But what we're doing is we're using a very generic term called entry. And it would also render down to edit text field, which is Android's version of a text box. They also have text views, which are their labels. So everyone has like their own names. And then on Windows, it would go down to a text box. So we're using an abstracted name that renders down to each one of the native controls. Now, the benefit with this is we create one and then it'll work with all of them. The downside is sometimes we want to do very specific things. So maybe we want to do a border or a shadow. Maybe that is enabled within Android but not within the iPhone. So because it's maybe enabled on one but not the other, it makes it difficult to make a cross-platform property that doesn't work on all entries or on all controls. So that's where custom renderers come in. So what I'm planning on doing today is using an image and putting an image on our application, but then rounding its corners. And rounded corners is something that's not enabled by default through any cross-platform image, but it's something you can do with code on each platform. So I think this is a really good example of showing how you can have custom code to solve a problem for the iPhone, and then using different custom code because Android is different than iOS. So we have to write separate code for the Android system to achieve the same result. So they're both the same result. They just are being implemented differently because they're different platforms. So this is exactly where a custom renderer really shines. When Forms first came out, I was a little leery of going to Xamarin Forms just because I was afraid I would lose the granularity that we have when we're native developers. I didn't want a language so watered down that I couldn't really do what I wanted to do. Through custom renderers, we can do anything a native developer can do, and that's really awesome. So when I was first learning how to use custom renderers, I actually went through this exact example on how to do it. It just helped me make a custom renderer for the first time. It's kind of silly. Basically, it's a text box where you're setting the background color on the iPhone to purple, and then green on Android, and then teal on Windows. So, but it's a good way of just kind of walking through and understanding how the custom renderer is being done. You're more than welcome to walk through this. I'm going to use it, but we're going to do something a little bit different with it because I think you guys could easily go through this process and not have a problem with it. But when you want to try to implement something different using the same methodology, sometimes that's where things fall apart. So that's what I'm going to do. Is I'm just going to guide you guys through doing a different control. So let's start by I'm going to open up my Xamarin Studio and do a new solution. And I'm just going to create a Xamarin Forms project. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a project called Rounded Corners. And I'm just going to go to my rounded corners XAML. And I'm gonna just use a stack layout. Okay, so I'm just going to center this image right on the page. I'm just going to do a centered image. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up a web browser, and I'm going to search for Bart Simpson. So I'm going to view image. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to save the image as. I'm going to put it right on my desktop. And then I'm going to open it. So within preview, what I want to do is I want to resize it. So I'm going to go to adjust size. And I'm going to make the height of it 320. So actually, I think I might make it a little bit smaller. I'm going to make it 200. Just so that way you'll be able to see it in the middle of the iPhone. And then what I want to do is I want to export it so that way I get it as a PNG. So instead of a GIF, I'm just going to export it as a PNG. I'm going to put it onto my desktop. I'm just going to save this. So if I look on my desktop, I've got one with a GIF. I'm going to delete the GIF. And I've got one without the extension, which is the PNG. So that's what I want to add into this. So in the iOS version, in order to add that image in, that's going to go I've got my resources drawable for Android. There should be resources. I'm going to add Bart into, I'm just going to add file. It's on my desktop. I'm going to copy it. So within your Android, it's resources drawable, bartsimpsons.png. Android, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm just going to call it resources. Oh, there it is. Alright, I guess I'm just looking right at it. And then I'm just going to add that file into the resources here. Add file. Bart Simpson. Okay, so I want to add an image. And then my source. It's going to be Bart. Oh, I got to have the name exactly right. So it's Bart Simpson. And then I'm just going to run it, see if that works. Okay, so there I've got my Bart Simpson. So white on white, I really won't be able to tell if I'm rounding the corner or not. So what I think I'm going to do is I am going to come over here. I'm going to bump these down to new lines just that way it gets a little bit easier to... I'm going to add a background color. So it's not going to be the most attractive app, but at least you'll be able to see where I'm going with this. So let's try that again. Now we should be able to see the square image in the center of the screen. That's what I was trying to get to. Okay, so now you can definitely see those corners are not rounded. So I've got a picture of Bart, and I just want to round up those corners. So at this point, my native control doesn't have any property or anything that has like rounded corners or anything like that. So what I want to do is I want to make my own control, but the image has a lot of properties and methods and things that are good, like the source. So I wouldn't want to create my own control from scratch. Otherwise, I would be giving up like the X name, and I'd be getting rid of the source. I'd be getting rid of like the the height, the width, all of those properties and methods that exist within that image control. So I want to make a new control based off of the old control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a custom folder. I'm going to call it custom. And then in this custom folder, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a subclass. I'm going to call it image box. So I'm going to add a new file, and it's going to be a class, and I'm just going to call it image box. So that's going to be my image. So I'm naming my custom control image box. Now, in order to make mine have everything the other control has within the class, I'm just going to inherit image. Now, I don't have image here, so I need to bring in my Xamarin Form. So I'm going to bring in a using statement. Xamarin. So within Xamarin Forms is the image object. By inheriting that, I get everything that image has, and now I can start adding my own stuff in here. So I'm not going to do anything with the constructor for right now. I'm going to actually just leave this alone. So I've got a new control called image box. So if I take a look at the website, really that's what they're doing here, is they're creating an empty class and they're calling it whatever, the other one was called, just inheriting entry and calling it my entry. That's basically what we're doing. Now we want to use the control. So there's a couple things you have to do. One is use the namespace. All right, so we have to bring in local and set it up to our namespace. So I'm actually gonna just copy this line, and I'll include this website with the link. And then within our XAML, all right, so I've got here's my beginning of my content page, and here's the end of my content page. Okay, so that's where this is. I'm opening it, I'm closing it, and in here are all of the different attributes. Okay, so I want to add in something new called the local, and then I've got my CLR namespace. Now my namespace really isn't custom renderer. If I look at my namespace, it's actually rounded corners is my namespace. If I go over here, rounded corners. So my namespace is rounded corners. So instead of custom render, I'm going to go rounded corners. The assembly is going to be rounded corners. So at this point, oh, it looks like there's a local in there. Oh, so I actually already had that in there. So it looks like I don't have to do that. As long as you have a local in there, I think you'll be okay. So then instead of using image like I did before, now I can start using my version, which I'm calling image box, which isn't a real control. I could have named this thing anything. You know, I could have called it Joe's box or Joe's control, and that would have worked as well. But I'm using image box. Now if I just use image box like this, it doesn't know what it is. So if I tried running this, it should bomb. If it doesn't bomb and it actually works, I'll be pretty impressed. But that should be a XAML error. Yeah, so it gave me a problem while it was loading the XAML because it doesn't know what that control is. But what I can do is I can add this local in front of it. So if it's local colon image box, if I take a look over here, that's what they're doing here. Is it's the local colon and then the name of the control. And then now that will let it know, oh, okay, you need to look within this namespace in order to get that control. So if I run this again, just by adding the local colon in front of it, should be able to map it to my property or my class. Yay, so I got Bart. All right, so I have everything that the image control has, but now I can extend it. I could add new methods. I could do whatever I want. So the next thing I do is I'm consuming it. Now I need to actually start to work on the custom renderer for it. So what I want to do here is I want to create a custom that's just for iOS. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna open up my iOS project and I'm gonna create a new folder in here. I'm gonna call it custom. And then within this custom, I'm gonna add a new class. In the name of this class, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call it image box renderer. That's what I'm going to do. Just so that way I know it's the image box, which is the top level shared control that I'm creating. And the renderer basically means when it's rendering to the page, when it's starting to be drawn onto the page, this is going to catch, and then my custom code is going to run the moment before it's displayed. So I'm just going to call it image box renderer. Okay, so now with my image box renderer, now what I can do is I can actually start doing this stuff. I can say that I want to pull in my assembly here, and my entity, the render entity. All right, so I'm just going to pull this in. And with the assemblies, I always put mine after the using statement but before the namespace. So I just put it in here. So first of all, export renderer needs to have Xamarin Forms. So I'm going to right click on that and go to Fix. I'm going to add the using Xamarin Forms. Okay, so then my entry doesn't exist, but I called this thing image box. It's the one within Xamarin Forms. So I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to and then image box render. Oops, don't do that. I'm going to copy that. Okay, so this is going to be the renderer that's going to fire off when my image box is being instantiated. So I had to add a couple using statements. I needed to add in my rounded corners, the roundedcorners.ios. So at this point, my assembly is good. I need to inherit my entry renderer. So for us, it's not going to be an entry renderer. It's going to be an image renderer, because that's the native thing that we're dealing with is our image. Image box renderer. I think it's just image renderer. So I'm going to get rid of the box because I don't believe that is correct. I believe it's image. And I think that's Xamarin Forms that I need to pull in. Okay, so Xamarin Forms Platform iOS. Then that gave me my image renderer. So you always go to the native control. So if it was an entry, it would be, entry renderer. And actually, this using statement was included up here, so I should have just included it. Okay, so I think at this point we've got this working. So now we've got our override on public override. So I'm just gonna copy this. And I'm just going to put it below my default constructor. So on element changed. So actually, because it's an image, it's not an element. So I probably shouldn't have. On element changed. Okay, so I'm gonna undo that. So at this point, what I want to do is I do want to see if I can do a protected override. So there's my on element changed. So not exactly sure why copying that didn't necessarily work the way I would have expected it to, but whatever. Sometimes just using the override and typing it out yourself. I'm sure there was something in here that was just a little bit different. Okay, so basically what I want to do is I want to do a couple checks. before I do anything. So I don't know for sure if it's my image or if it's a different image. So what I can do is I can get into my E, which is my event arg, and I can find out if it's the old element or an element. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do an if statement. And then within this if statement, I'm going to do my E, and then I'm going to say old element. And as long as the old element is not equal to null, or that's a pipe, so it's the shift and then right above the enter key, the backslash, or the element is equal to null, return. So basically, don't do anything. So if the old element is not equal to null and the element is equal to null, we don't want to try to change something that basically doesn't exist. So let's just say for now, life is good, it exists. What I want to do is I'm just going to create another method here, and I'm just going to call it a private void, because we're not going to return anything, we're just going to do something. I'm going to call it create box. So if that's good, we're going to call create box, and that's going to do our rounded corners for us. So that's going to be where our logic's going to be. Okay, so on element change, but there's also an on element property changed. So I want to take a look at that as well. On element property changed. I'm going to hit enter. So at this point, what I want to know is if the property name is the same as the property name being passed in. So I'm going to do another if statement here. So there's two different ways that this image may render, and I'm just going to do an if. And actually, I probably should do that here just for readability. I've got an if statement. I didn't do my curly braces. Technically, if you've got a one-liner, you don't have to do that. But I'm just going to do that so that maybe it's a little bit more readable. Okay, so this time, if this is true, then I'm going to do this. So now, what I want to do is I want my property name, so I'm going to go e.propertyName. If that happens to be equal to my visual element, and then I've got a property, height property, and that has a property name. If that's equal to that, or same thing again, I'm going to do my e dot property name is going to be equal to my visual element, and my visual element has a width property, which has a property name as well. So what I can do for readability is right after this OR statement, I'm just going to hit enter. So if my property name is equal to my height property name, or if my property name is equal to my width property name, then we're going to move forward and create this box. So there's two different ways that we can do this. And to be honest with you, I had to Google a little bit to figure out how to tap into the image box rendering. So that's where this came from. So when you're in the real world, you're going to be kind of Googling around trying to figure out, how to make something work. So at this point, when this image render happens, I'm just going to go var x equals 1 semicolon. I'll put a breakpoint on here, just so that way you can actually see that when this fires off, I will hit the breakpoint. We're not going to round anything, we're not going to do anything, but it will eventually work. So boom, it's not visible yet, hits my breakpoint, and if I come over here, it's still not visible. If I let it run, so it hit it 3 times, but it's not rounded because we didn't write that code. So what I want to do is I want to actually put the code in here to do the rounded corners. So I'm going to actually go to the native. All right, so we're actually going to be writing more of a native style language. So I'm going to go control.layer, corner radius, and I'm going to set the corner radius equal to 25, and then I'm going to do a control layer. I'm actually going to do that a couple of times, so I'm just going to copy it so I don't have to type it. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to mask to bounds. And that's going to be expecting a bool, so I'm going to pass in a false. And then the next thing I'm going to do is border color. And my border color is going to be Xamarin Forms. And I'm going to do from hex. Let's try color from hex. So now you can get very specific. It's a string, a hex string that it's expecting in there. So I'm just going to do like a 1B1D24. So that's a specific color that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to convert that to RGB. Or GC color. Okay, so now inside the layer, I have a border width. And I'm going to make that equal to 1. And then my control layer. Actually, it's not even a layer. At this point, I'm going to clip to bounds. That's going to be equal to true. Okay, so now this code here will do the rounded portion of this. Now, to be honest with you, I mean, I Googled trying to figure out how to round within iOS, and I found this snip of code that helps. Now, things could go wrong in here, and if something does go kind of goofy, I don't know if I want the whole app to crash. I'd rather have it have squared corners and seeing the image than the app crashing. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a try catch, just because things could go kind of funky. So if I do a try catch, and then I'm just gonna run that. Let's see if this works. Yay! So I've got my border, I've got my shading, I've got my everything's good there. Now on Android, we're not doing the rounded corners because we didn't create the custom renderer. So on Android, it just won't be catching the onElementChanged event and then doing any custom code. So if we don't do it on Android, that's perfectly fine. We can actually have rounded corners on iOS and square images on Android. That's up to us. Now, since your emulator may not be working that well on the virtual machine, if you don't do it, that's fine. If you just record up to this point, that's fine. I'm going to go through and do the Android portion because I'm sure there's quite a few of you that want to make the Android portion work. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that working. So it's going to be similar in some senses here. So I'm just going to stop, and I'm going to close everything except for my image rounded corner. And then I'm going to open up my Android. And then within my Android, I'm going to create a custom folder. And then in my custom folder, I'm going to create the same exact file here, the image box renderer. So that's going to be the class I'm going to be creating. I'm going to add a new file, and then I'm going to call it that image box renderer. Now, I can't just copy all of this and paste it over here, all right? Because now we're dealing with Android, and Android's a little bit different than iOS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my Genymotion up and going. So that way I have an Android player. And then I'm going to set Android as my startup project. And before I write any code, I just want to make sure Android is working. Okay, so my emulator's up. I'm going to start up Genymotion. So I should see a square BART. And it's perfectly fine to have some things rendered differently on the iPhone than they do on the Android. And sometimes you're going to have no choice. Like the switch. There is no text property on a switch on the iPhone, but there is on Android. Just because the switch has a text property on Android doesn't mean that you can't access it. You just have to go through the custom renderer to do that. Okay, so Android's working. I've got square corners. At this point, really all I need to do is get the code for the custom renderer working, because it's actually running everything correctly. It's just not catching the Android portion of it because I never wired anything up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start wiring that up. So from the iOS, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab that same assembly, and below my using, but above my namespace, I'm going to add that. So export render, I'm going to fix this. So I'm going to have to add in a using statement for xamarin.forms. My image box, I'm going to fix that. So I'm going to need to add in the rounded corners assembly. And then my image box renderer, I'm going to add in my droid. So all of those are good. I also have the Xamarin Forms platform, but instead of iOS, I'm going to do an Android. and then that will allow me to inherit from the image renderer, just like we did before. So this class is now going to go inherit from the image renderer. So far, really everything's pretty tight. So I'm going to get rid of my default constructor, and I need to get an override. I need to override something. So I'm going to go protected, override, and this time it's not going to be an on. It's actually draw child. Draw child, there it is. Okay, so when you hit enter, it'll automatically fill that in there for you. So you're going to have your canvas, and you're going to have your view, and you're going to have your draw time. So this is really what we're going to do, is when we're drawing up the child element, we're just going to modify it before it returns back to the base. So, and once again, what I had to do is I needed to find this example online on an Android, Xamarin Android forum. And so the first thing I'm going to do is clip path. Okay, so I need to create my radius, so I'm going to create a variable which is going to be called radius. Oops, missed an I in there. And that's going to be 25, which is going to be a float. Okay, so then I need to create a path. Okay, so I'm missing a using here because path is an object that I want to tap into. I know it exists. So I'm going to add in the Android graphics. That's where path comes from. Okay, so then I need my rectangle RE. Okay, so this thing is going to be, we're going to get the dimensions of it. So I'm going to go 0, 0, and then I'm going to go width and height. HEI, there we go. And again, this was a lot of just kind of messing around and playing with some other people's code, trying to figure out how to actually create the shape that's going to basically be, it's like the cutout of where we're going to go. So, all right, so path is going to have add rounded rack. So this is setting up the path direction of what's going to be getting clipped out of the image. Okay, so at this point we're good. I'm going to go canvas, save. Now I can clip that. Canvas, clip, path. And then the path that I'm going to be clipping is the one that we just created. Alright, so I'm going to save that as a result. Okay, so at this point we created our path to clip out. So we know the image, we know the size, we know the dimensions, and so now the next thing we want to do is we want to create the border for what we, so that way we kind of get that black border around the rounded image. Okay, so I'm going to reset my path to a new path. I'm going to do the same thing here again with add rounded rectangle to the path. So I'm just going to copy that so that way I don't have to retype that. And now what I want to do is I want to create a paint object. And now what I want to do is I want to set up like my anti-aliasing and the stroke width, and I want to really just set up what that border is going to look like. So my paint, anti-alias, oh, I want paint. Then my stroke width is going to be 1. Then I've got my paint style. Oh, I'm sorry, it's set style. Okay, so I'm going to pass in my style, which is going to be my paint style stroke. So then I'm going to set my color. So to get to the global coloring system on Android, it's just global : and then it's Android dot graphics dot color dot, and then I'm just going to go RGB. All right, so my RGB is going to be 11, 11, 14. All right, so now we need to set up the canvas draw path. Draw path. Okay, so then what this is going to be is this is going to be where we need to draw the border around it. So we've got our path already set up, and then we need paint. That's going to be our color and all of that stuff. All right, so then we're almost done. Now we're going to clean up. So that way we don't have any type of memory issues. Whenever I'm dealing with anything with drawing, paint, and color, I always like to really be careful that I don't have any memory leaks. So paint dot dispose, and then I also want to do my path dispose. Okay, so then what I want to do is I just want to return my result. So the result is what we set up originally. Right, here's our result. So and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a try-catch around this. So we're going to try it. If all works, life is good. If not, at least we'll have square corners. All right, so I'm just going to give this a try in Android again. Yay! So now we can see that we've got the rounded corners on Android. Worst case scenario, we hit a phone that doesn't support this, which is very, very likely. Android's a very fragmented operating system base, so not everybody may have the ability to manipulate the canvas and draw paths around it. So this first part was basically setting up the overlay that crops the rounded corners, and then the second part creates the path to draw the black line around it. So that's really what we were doing. The main thing is, it's not important to really fully understand the code in this part. The big thing that I'm trying to show is in iOS, there's one way of doing something. To do the same thing in Android may be completely different. It very most likely is completely different unless somebody created a library that helped you do it the same way. You're going to Google around, you're going to find ways to do certain things in iOS and certain ways to do things in Android, and you can do all of the native things you want to do. you'll have to find examples and kind of work through it, and this actually took me days to originally get going. So it's not like I just knew how to do paths and canvases and cropping, and you know, it's just the way that is. But at this point, you definitely know how to do custom renderers, and you know that any element you can get down to the metal and interact with that element directly. So anyways, hopefully this video helps.